War took place. Although tensions remained high during much of this time, the period between 1960s and 1979 were considered a temporary easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the Cold War all started at the end of World War II when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While this action helped end the war, it also triggered a global fear of nuclear mass destruction, especially from the newly developed Soviet Union. The term Iron Curtain was used to describe the ideological and physical boundary that divided Eastern and Western Europe. This line represented the division between communist nations led by the Soviet Union and the democratic countries aligned with the West, particularly the United States. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built to keep East Germans from fleeing to the West. It became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War, literally dividing a city and the world. Then, in 1962, the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from the US, and for 13 tense days, it looked like nuclear war was about to break out until both sides backed down. So yes, this is your basic Cold War history, but here's the thing. While this tension was happening across the globe, there was another kind of struggle happening at home. What about race during this time? How did Americans, especially Black Americans and other marginalized groups, feel living through the global fear and fighting for their rights at the same time? Now, the movie Hidden Figures, released in 2016, based on the book by Margot Lee Shetterly, shines light on this exact issue. It tells the story of 4 African-American women who worked at NASA during the space race. These women played crucial roles in the helping and launch of American astronauts into space. Despite facing racism, sexism in their workplace, their work was essential to the U.S. staying ahead in the space race. Now, a quote from Hidden Figures that captures just how unfairly African Americans, especially Black women, were treated in both the workplace and in society. It also shows how little recognition they received despite how vital their work was. The quote by Dorothy Vann says it best: "Separate and equal are 2 different things." Now, this quote highlights just how many barriers African Americans faced during this time. These women weren't just doing groundbreaking work in math, science, and engineering, they were also pushing through deep-rooted inequality every single day. The Cold War wasn't just about fighting communism, it was also about who got to enjoy that freedom, and who America believed was worth fighting for. We were so determined to keep communism out of our homes, but when it came to giving all Americans equal rights, that idea seemed foreign to us. And that raises the question, wasn't freedom the very thing we claimed to be fighting for?
Social structure. So as Kate already mentioned, Europe was kind of split into 2 between democratic states and communist states. The communist states were kind of used to separate the Soviet Union from the West, and they were also used as puppet states to control, separating Eastern and Western Europe. In the communist Eastern states, the economy was usually often controlled by the government and usually inefficient. Also, there were a lot of food shortages, housing crisis, the wages were low, basic necessities like healthcare and education were usually free, but in terms, I'd say the living standards were usually worse. Subsequently, compared to the Western capitalist states, there were a lot of mixed economies in the capitalist states, with both having private and public businesses, leading to higher living standards, better wages, better housing. A lot of consumer goods were available, which early on during the Cold War caused a lot of Eastern Europeans to move to the West. These factors created a distorted image of communism in the West, especially in the United States, of what communism really stands for. This video and presentation will include interviews questioning first-hand witnesses of the Cold War and direct analytical breakdown of the presidential speeches, which then with the gathered information will be used to answer the question, what does it mean to be American through the lens of race?
During the Cold War, what messages, either in school, media, or society, did you receive about race in America?
I think growing up, I don't know that I defined it as being during the Cold War, but I think looking back, you can identify that there was obviously realize now I'm a little bit older and I understand what the Cold War was a little bit. I think there was a more unified message about what it means to be an American in terms of, we had a defined enemy, so to speak. So while race has always played a part in American history and how we see ourselves and see others, I don't think it was maybe emphasized quite as much during that time, I know, but I can only come from my own perspective. I'm sure somebody from another race would have maybe a different opinion or how they perceive themselves. But it did seem that in America there was a little bit more unification about that we were all Americans, and it wasn't so much. While race was obviously always a part of us, it wasn't the defining characteristic all the time.
Oh, 7th, 8th grade, and they were starting that in LA, starting the busing thing. But to a large extent, it ended up being the people in power, which my family lived in a kind of a pretty white area when you think about it. But kids were bused from the inner city to the suburbs, to the San Fernando Valley, hour and a half, some kids. One of them later on became famous, Tiffany Haddish. She was a lot younger than me, but she went to the same school I did. And she spoke about it in one of her, this one interview that I heard, just because she went to the same school I did. And she, hour and a half. I remember there would be about 25, 30 kids that would show up, bused in our school. And, they integrated seamlessly into the culture and curriculum. But I thought it was a good thing. So, I don't know. It's hard to say about the Cold War. I mean, as far as that goes, I think America was much more roiling than just the Cold War. That was more an American issue. And that was where it was fairness, justice, equality, and tolerance of diverse beliefs. And I think that I was taught that at a young age. My mother and my father, I'd grown up with parents who had been to college. My dad was a Harvard graduate, grew up with nothing, grew up with an alcoholic parent, absent father, and very fortunate, GI Bill, got to go to Harvard, and he was a very tolerant man. He was a very, he understood that people are people, regardless of the color of their skin. So, and my mother as well, both of them had that mindset. So I wasn't really, I was very fortunate. I didn't have any kind of that racial separatism from my parents at all. Now, I think society was pretty segregated at the time. About race in America?
Yeah.
I don't recall ever receiving that type of message. It was more about the dangers inherent in the communist regimes, that type of thing, the fear of the atomic bomb and all that. When I was in that period in my life, that was the main thing, in the 60s and 70s. I grew up in the late 60s, was when I was, first had consciousness, and then 70s, graduated high school in 78. So by that time, obviously, civil rights had already passed. We had the assassinations in my dim early consciousness of Dr. King. But as far as the Cold War wasn't really part of that, so as far as
Presidential speeches. Though there were many presidents during the Cold War, 9 to be exact, for time's sake we're going to focus on the important ones regarding communism. Harry S. Truman. After the end of the war, the US government was already apprehensive about communism. Therefore, Truman proposed the Truman Doctrine.
Greece must have assistance if it is to become a self-supporting and self-respecting democracy. One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
Initially, Truman is insinuating that the United States will fight for democracy when it's challenged, no matter who, what, where, or when, signifying that they're the protector of freedom and equality. Kind of hypocritical considering there were millions of African Americans being segregated at that time.
This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
Furthermore, Truman's trying to justify the US's involvement in Greece and is trying to paint a negative picture that the USSR and communism are deprivating humans of basic fundamental rights. JFK. JFK was the third president during the Cold War. A decade into the Cold War, Joseph Stalin has died, and due to conditions in East Berlin, many defectors were going to West Berlin, causing the Soviet Union to put up a blockade and a big iron wall, leading to JFK's famous speech.
What is the great issue between the free world and the communist world? Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
JFK is drawing a clear line between democracy and communism. He clearly divides the two, referring to them as the free world. Whether JFK is referring to communist politicians or leaders, he persists that they come to Berlin to see what it's like.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
In undoubtedly the most iconic part of his speech, JFK compares the people of communism to that of prisoners who were locked and kept away, hinting at the flaw of communism.
During the Cold War, the United States was in a high-stakes global competition with the Soviet Union, not just over weapons or politics, but over their ideological beliefs. The US positioned itself as the leader of the free world, a model of democracy and equality. But this image clashed sharply with the reality of segregation and racial injustice in the US. This contradiction weakened America's global standing and opened the door for criticism, especially from the Soviet Union, which used American racism as propaganda. The US, realizing the severity of the situation, tried to show the world that this image was wrong. However, African Americans were quick to call out the hypocrisy. Leaders like Webb Du Bois and Paul Robeson linked the civil rights struggles to global anti-colonial movements, demanding that the US live up to the values it claimed to represent. Meanwhile, the US government began to feel pressure, not necessarily from an urge to make things right, but because racial violence and segregation made America have a bad image in the eyes of the world. However, progress was made. One major turning point in this period was the breaking of the color barrier in Major League Baseball. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play in the MLB, joining the Brooklyn Dodgers. His presence on the field was more than just a sports milestone. It was a symbol. The US could point to Robinson as proof of racial progress, especially when under international scrutiny. His courage and success challenged stereotypes and helped start a broader conversation about race, equality, and opportunity. Presidents also played a role in shaping the racial narrative during the Cold War. Presidents like John F. Kennedy cautiously supported civil rights, aware that America's image abroad depended on it. Decades later, Ronald Reagan spoke more about patriotism and national pride, but faced criticism for not doing enough to address racial inequality, even as he emphasized America's superiority over the Soviet Union. Asian Americans also used Cold War dynamics to push for their civil rights. Often viewed with suspicion due to their ethnic background, many Asian Americans aligned their calls for equality with the US's desire to present itself as inclusive and democratic. This helped win reforms in areas like housing, education, and citizenship. In the end, the Cold War forced the US to acknowledge the problem of racism apparent in the country. Civil rights became a matter of foreign policy as much as domestic justice. Progress didn't come easily, but with global pressure, activism, presidential influence, and figures like Jackie Robinson and Webb Du Bois leading by example, the U.S. took steps, however slow, towards confronting racial injustice and living up to the ideals it promoted around the world. While racism may not be entirely gone from the United States, there is no denying that the progress made during the Cold War will forever leave a positive impact on this country.